All right, we're going to talk about the miter saw today. I want to do a couple tips and tricks, show you how to use it properly, how to lay out and mark a board, and then how to get that board cut to the size that you've marked it at. This is our 12-inch Bosch. We have a 12-inch DeWalt and we've got a 10-inch Makita. All the operation is pretty much the same. Little nuances here and there that we can discuss in a little bit more detail later. So the whole purpose of a chop saw is to cross-cut boards down to a manageable size, or a finished size for that matter. We get boards that are 10, 12 feet long. We only need a small chunk of them, so we want to take a 10-foot, 12-foot long board, get it down to a smaller piece that we can then go and do all the rest of the milling that we need to do with it. On this particular saw, this is what we call a sliding compound miter saw, which means that we have a lock back here that we can unlock, and that allows the head and the motor to slide to accommodate cutting wider boards. If we have a narrower board like this, there is no need for us to use the slide. We can leave that locked, okay, and bring our cut down, and you can see it will cut all the way through the board without having to do any sliding. On a wider board like this one, okay, we may need to do a slide, so you will have to unlock. You will bring the saw out. You will turn it on, come down, go in, and up, and turn the saw off. Whenever we can, we want to leave that slide locked, but sometimes it's going to be necessary for you to unlock it. So a couple of safety rules here. You're going to want to operate the machine with your right hand, and you're going to want to hold material with your left hand. Your left hand needs to be sure to hold your board in place the entire time you are cutting your material. We can't just put this in here and chop down. If we do that, the saw is going to grab the board and huck it across the room. So your left hand is going to push down on the table and into the fence of the miter saw. So we wedge it in that corner. That will hold this secure enough so that while the saw blade is working its way through the material, it won't go anywhere. We want to make sure that long stock is accounted for or held in place by these tables. Right? That's why we have such a long table here. So when you have a longer board, all of the board is supported, and we don't run the risk of anything tipping off of the table while we're cutting. We talk a little bit, or we're going to talk a lot about kickback areas of machines. And a kickback area is the area around the machine where scrap or stock can get thrown if we aren't using the machine properly. And that all relates to the rotation of the blade. On the miter saw, the blade is going to rotate away from you at the bottom. So anything that gets caught in the blade is going to want to be thrown back towards the wall and the windows here. So we're not in too bad a shape here in terms of the kickback area, but we want to be aware that anything left loose on the table could get thrown backwards against the wall or the windows. So we want to be aware of that while we're operating this particular machine. So let's talk about how we cut and mark up our boards. The miter saw is going to cut in a straight line for us, so there's no need for us to go out and make a really long line across our stock. It doesn't do us any good to do that. What we want to do, okay, is mark our board with a little tick mark. Let's say I'm going to cut this to 19 inches. So I'm going to put a tick mark at 19 inches. Okay, I want to keep this side of the board. So when I line this up, okay, I want the longest side to the left. Okay, and I'm going to line the blade up with the saw or my mark so that the blade is on the waste side of my line. That way anything that gets cut and turned into sawdust is off the waste side and not off my keep side. So on this particular board, I know I'm going to have to slide, so I am going to unlock. Okay, I'm going to line myself up with my mark. Okay, I'm going to bring the saw out. I'm going to turn it on, go down and through. Okay, hold on to everything until that blade stops coasting, and then you can retrieve your scrap stock and your finished part. On a narrower board, it's going to be the exact same operation, okay, except we're going to lock the slide. Now when we come to making our legs and some of our other material or parts are going to be made out of thicker stock. So we're going to have to do a different kind of operation here. Again, we're going to mark the board where we want. Okay, we'll do 19 inches again. Okay, and I might mark it at a couple points, and I'll show you why here in a second. So on a thicker board, we're going to want to do a little bit different operation here. Long side to the left still. We're going to line up our blade and our mark at the same way we did on the thinner board. However, on a thicker board, we can't cut all the way through at one time. The saw is just not going to handle that. And we could run into a situation where it binds on the blade and we get kicked back and all kinds of nasty stuff can happen. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come out, I'm going to come down into the board about maybe halfway, go through, up, out, and I'm going to keep going in that motion until I end up all the way through the board. So again, it's going to be out, on, down, through, and around, and taking little nibbles until I get all the way through the board. Okay, again, wait for it to stop before you retrieve any of your stuff. And you can see that by taking little passes, we can get through decently. We end up with a fairly decent finish, and we don't run the risk of binding anything. So that's how you're going to rough cut boards down to length. Let's talk about finish cutting a board to a finished dimension. So let's say I took my piece and I've planed it and I've ripped it to the right width, and now I need to get it to a finished length. That's a two-step process on the saw here. What we're going to do is we're going to line up again, and I'm going to take just a little bit, maybe the width of a saw blade, off of one end of the board. Okay. What I've done now is I've made the end of this board nice and clean, and it's 90 degrees or square to my other two adjacent sides and faces. What I'm going to do now is from that end, I'm going to measure to my finished dimension, 16 inches in this case, put my tick mark, long side off to the left, line up with my mark again, just like before, and go ahead and make your finish. Okay, by doing that two-step process, I ensure that both ends are cut nice and clean and everything is square to everything else. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the safety behind the saw. We talked about having your hands, your left hand on the left holding the long piece of stock, your right hand is going to operate the machine. We don't ever want to run into a situation where we're crossing arms or anything like that, because we run into the potential of cutting into ourselves. We also want to try and avoid doing something like this, because now our support for the board is way over here and not within the fence area and the table of the saw. So this is the best position that you can get in to operate the machine safely. We want to try and keep our fingers, a safe distance away, maybe 6 inches away, which means that you cannot come in here and try and cut really tiny pieces. For two reasons. One, your hands are way too close. The other reason is there's no fence back here, so this becomes very easy to twist and tip into the blade and cause a kickback. The other thing we want to make sure we don't do on this machine is rip. Okay? And remember, ripping is cutting with the grain direction. This saw is meant for cross-cutting only. So on this board, okay, even though this is the longer dimension, okay, we do not want to rip on this board. We always want to cut across the grain. If we try and rip, this saw blade is not set up to do that. It's going to bog down, it's going to jam, and it's going to grab a hold of the board. We need to make sure that on the chop saws, we are only cross-cutting our material. Let's talk about a situation that you're going to run into often when we're cutting longer stock. Wood is going to warp, it's going to change shape a little bit. And when we come to the chop saw here, we want to make sure we're setting ourselves up so that when we cut our material in half, we're not going to get any catching, binding, or kickbacks. If you look at this board right now, you can see that at the table, there's a gap. If I were to cut in this position, when I get all the way through the board with the saw, these two pieces are going to want to fall in on each other, closing the gap where the saw blade is. If that happens, those two boards, the ends of the board, are going to pinch on the saw blade as it's rotating and could cause the piece that you're not holding on to get thrown around, or it could cause the saw blade to bind inside to the cut and become jammed. If you run into a situation like this, flip the board over so that it's flat at the fence and the table. That way, when I cut through here, the board will fall away from the blade as opposed to falling into the blade. On a board that has got a really severe twist, like this one, okay, you can see the board is kind of going in a twisty motion or a twisty direction here. We want to do everything in our power, okay, when we support this board to make sure it is flat or as flat as can be at the position of the cut. That way all of this over here, when I cut through, it'll just fall away as opposed to falling into or in toward the blade.